So welcome to the Sentinel,
Thank
Governor.
you.
So you mentioned the vote that the Senate is scheduled to take today. So I would say let's start with that. In October, in one of your analysis pieces that you've written, you wrote, if Republican members of the U.S. Senate join in lockstep to prevent Trump's removal, they will cease to exist as a major factor in national politics after November 2020. So here we are. And by all accounts, that's exactly what they're going to do,
Right.
with maybe one exception. So do you expect that Republicans are going to lose ground in the Senate come November?
Well, I expect they're going to lose the Senate.
And so if that's the case, how do you see yourself as a Republican candidate winning an election?
Well, I mean, the strategy remains what it's always been, exceed expectations in New Hampshire, get a following wind going into Super Tuesday. Super Tuesday is pretty friendly jurisdictions, Massachusetts, Vermont, Colorado, California, and go on from there. Obviously, it requires something to change to mark a break in the action, a break in the ice with Trump's seeming hold on the Republican Party. But it's not every state where he commands 98% of the Republicans in the state. That's not the case in this state. And people say, how are you gonna turn around the diehard Trump voters? I'm not. I didn't go to the evangelicals during our 2 days of campaigning in Iowa and say, come with me. But we did keep the president from doing a clean sweep of the delegates there based on 2 days of campaigning. And here we've had 240 days. I'd like to say we'll do 100 times as well, but that would be over 100%, so that's not likely. But I do see a path to doing well on Super Tuesday, and beyond that point, who knows? You've got among other things Steve Bannon out there saying if there's a fissure in the Republican support and these damn moderates can alienate even 3 or 4% of the voters in the Republican side from Trump, we're not going to win the election. Well, I pay attention to things like that. The goal is to win, and the goal is always to win and get 51%. And the press sometimes asks me, well, what if you just put a hole in the bottom of the good ship Trump and cause him to sink in November, but you don't win yourself? Would that be winning? And my answer is no, that would not be winning, but that would be a substantial achievement. And I look at all this on two levels. Number one is the issues level, and when I got in, I was mainly talking about the issues, things I want to do differently. For example, not having trillion-dollar deficits, and I think I could eliminate the deficit pretty quickly, as I did in Massachusetts, by the scheme of zero-based budgeting, where you start every account at zero unless it justifies itself by its performance last year. So you measure outcomes. In Washington, they measure inputs, which is last year's appropriation. And the Dems want to increase social spending 5%. The R's want to increase military spending 5%. So they get together after they've all been safely reelected, and they compromise by raising everything 15%. You're not going to avoid a trillion-dollar deficit that way. So by zero basing, I balanced the budget that was 16% out of balance in 2 months in Massachusetts and never had any problem there. Partly because I reached right across the aisle to the Democrats and said, let's have a social meeting every Monday afternoon, and we did. It was very good for cooperation and good relations between the branches. And so we agreed to do consensus revenue estimates for the coming year. And that avoided what Dukakis and the legislature spent endless amounts of time and bitter arguments what the revenue is going to be for next year. And if you're not on the same page, then obviously your budgets are going to be out of whack. But we did a consensus budget. I was not exactly the darling of the teachers union and other public employee groups, but we worked through it all. So that's another difference between me and Mr. Trump. Climate change is a third. I spoke with Klobuchar and Mayor Pete in Concord on that earlier today. And if I do say so, my plans about putting a fee on carbon and how it's going to be administered are more detailed than at least some of the Democratic plans, e.g. Senator Sanders, who says, I'm going to spend $16.3 trillion combating climate change. That's it. It's kind of like the education issue. You know, I'm going to have almost everything free. Well, I can top that. Everything is going to be free.
So you mentioned that in Massachusetts reaching across the aisle.
Yeah.
So you saw the State of the Union last night, and it did not look like a climate in which there would be a lot of reaching across the aisle.
I mean, it was a campaign rally, and I can understand how the speaker might have, in frustration, thought it was not worthy of her chamber.
And
causing her to rip up the speech.
There does seem to be that real ideological rift. It's in Washington, and it's across the nation.
Well, that's a personality rift, not just ideological.
Well, that is, perhaps, but aside from that, when people talk about the dysfunction of Washington, there is this partisanship that people can't get past there, and some people feel that that's reflective of the nation, and some people feel that that's pushing the nation apart. Which is the dog and which is the tail?
I think Trump is the Prince of Denmark in this narrative. Having said that, in other words, I think he's responsible for a lot of the bitterness down there and the fact that everybody hates each other. But it's not all Trump. It didn't start with Trump. It started with the election of 1994, since which there's been much more hyper-gerrymandering and hyper-partisanship, and you can only lose your seat in a primary, and so you're incented to have an extreme position. All that has become more true since the election of 1994, but Mr. Trump has definitely taken it to a new level, and his level is personal, and it's vindictiveness, and it's insulting. It's not political. It's not, we disagree with you as a party because you spend far too much money, or we disagree with you as a party because you grind the face of the poor. No, it's much less respectful than that. And that's no way to run a railroad. And if I, perish forbid, if I get there, I'll not only have a bipartisan cabinet going in, as I did in Massachusetts. I never even asked anybody who I was interviewing for a judgeship or a part in the cabinet, whether they were a D or an R, because I didn't think it was any of my business. I just wanted them to do the best job they could. And I let, nature take its course. My cabinet eventually proved to be eight women and 3 men. And the only white male in the cabinet was Charlie Baker, who's now the governor. So he was really good. Had to be.
So I want to follow up a little bit on your kind of idea that the electorate may be there, kind of, to support you, that kind of that voter base may exist. But how do you plan to build an organization that can, kind of realistically compete in all the primary states and challenge the substantial resources of President Trump's campaign at this point?
Well, organization can come out of electoral success, which can come in stages. I mean, I think it's a little different now because you have online fundraising, but Pete Buttigieg came out of nowhere because he kind of took hold. Now, Andrew Yang, the closet Republican, is the new flavor of the month. Although I will point out that I got the same percentage in Iowa that Andrew Yang did, and I outperformed Tom Steyer in terms of percentage of the vote. And that's on 2 days campaigning.
Yeah.
I think there's a good slug of what I'll call decent people voters in every state, which are in the R and which are in the D, varies by state. But there's a long tradition of reasonable Republicans. You don't have to call them moderates, but in the Republican Party in New Hampshire. And, just to take one example, I've read in many places that the Republican Party rank and file are 65% in favor of reproductive rights. That is not typical of the country as a whole in the Republican Party. And when I say to an audience in this state, I'm a New England Republican, they know exactly what I mean, which is that I'm flinty, fiscally conservative, fiscally responsible. In fact, I was ranked the most fiscally conservative governor in the country by the Wall Street Journal and the Cato Institute when I was in office. That's coming right after 3 terms of Mike Dukakis in a state that was called Massachusetts until I got there. And on the other hand, New England Republican means socially welcoming, open, certainly not, throwing down an iron curtain between the government and any groups that may be disadvantaged for some reason, like immigrants in Donald Trump's world, for example.
I want to turn to the issue of healthcare, if you're able. So, your healthcare plan relies on market forces, but it was kind of the alleged failure of those market forces that brought about the Affordable Care Act a decade ago. So, why do you think that those same market forces will provide a different outcome now, than they did a decade ago and brought,
Well, so my thinking about the Affordable Care Act is I wouldn't set out to repeal it. It added 20 million people to the rolls of the insured, which is a very big move on the cost containment side of the ledger. And if you're designing a healthcare system for the United States at the national level, the 2 things you have to keep always uppermost in mind is cost containment and also preserving the quality of the system. My one beef with the sort of not overwhelming but recurrent in many places with the Affordable Care Act is that there just seems to me to be a bit too much government in it. And there was a state of mind, people who were drafting it, we can't let people make their own decisions because they're so stupid they'll all die, and we can't have that because we have a responsibility to make sure no one ever dies. I'm joking a little bit, but it reminds me of the Harry and Louise ad when they were trying to get Hillary Clinton's bill through in 1993. They had an ad talking, and somebody says, no, but everyone has to die, even Leon Panetta, who was a member of their cabinet, a great guy, former Republican. So, for example, it mandates that everybody have the Cadillac plan and that we have total coverage for everything up to the day of death, which goes in the opposite of the right direction on cost containment. And I think the one signal thing that I proposed, which is slightly different, and this is referred to in the exchange provisions of the Act, but it's not really fleshed out, and that's to allow people to have their own health savings accounts, which means they take money that they've earned and they put it on a tax advantage basis, which means no currently paying taxes, not till you take it out. And they build up a nest egg against an exigent or even emergency situation somewhere in their family, so storing up nuts against the winter. So they can kind of be the judge of how much they want to do that. And people say, well, how could they possibly make that decision? They'll put away too much money or not enough money, but that's wrong. That's the government bureaucrat who can't balance their own checkbook at the end of the month or the end of the year, when every family in the United States has to do that. And people are situated differently economically. And somebody, for example, who cannot take a $500 unplanned hit in their income, they wouldn't be able to buy food, rent, and medicine, that month. They're going to want 0 deductibles, so they have the lowest premium possible. So they never have the risk of that unplanned $500. And someone with more of a cushion will want the highest possible deduction to get the lowest premium.
But I guess before the ACA, there were more people who were not insured. So if you roll back,
but I'm all in favor of that. I'm all in favor of what it did in getting more people insured.
But I guess I'm wondering, how will you kind of correct for those market forces if you roll back some of the regulation that's currently in existence around healthcare?
Well, I'm not sure about the reference to market forces. I'm aware of specific things I proposed, But, places that I'd like to roll it back would be, it's now impossible to buy insurance across state lines. Why? That's crazy. It's much cheaper if you buy it in Indiana than today. Why should that be illegal? And you can't buy prescription drugs in Canada. They're 33% cheaper. And I've been doing that for years. I think maybe even before it was legal. I spent a reasonable amount of time in Canada on business. And the one area where my thinking has gone the other direction is on big pharma. And for decades I thought, oh, people who attack big pharma are so misinformed. We have to, they do all the discovery of the great pharmaceuticals, and we've got to make sure they cover their overhead for that long lead time. And now, seeing the hearings last year in the House, where the committee chairman asked them to explain why they charge 3 times as much in the United States as in Germany for the same drug. And the answer was, well, it's very, very complicated, Mr. Chairman, because you see conditions are totally different, and you have to carry the 4 and divide by 3, and you look over here and then over there, and it's not the same thing at all. And so it's very, very complex, as you can see. Does that answer your question? And it didn't answer the question, and it was ludicrous. So I've, gone back over that ground, tried to understand it. It's incomprehensible. So with a heavy heart, I report that I've decided to change on the issue of whether Medicare should have the authority to negotiate prescription drug prices. I think we have to let them do it. And that's more government. So I'm an eclectic picker of government power or not.
One way that quite a number of people were added to the insured rolls was through Medicaid expansion, which of
Right.
course is voluntary in the states as a result of the Supreme Court ruling. It strikes me that the people who have been added to the rolls because of that may not be in a position to take advantage of medical savings accounts.
No, that's right. It's
Yes.
just something I want to add for those people.
So
who
is where we are in Medicaid expansion the right place, in your view?
Well, I've never been against Medicaid expansion in the States. I saw my friend John Kasich take no end of pipe when he expanded it in Ohio, and sort of was on his side. I would leave that, I think, to the states, but I'm not opposed to it.
So when you talk about going to Canada for drugs, because they're so much cheaper there, so there's been a lot of talk about, well, we should be able to get our drugs in Canada, to which every time I've seen that raised, Canada says, wait, no, because then that's going to drive our prices up. So is the cost of drugs, you explained the shell game and explanation that the pharma gave before Congress for why drug prices are higher here than elsewhere. Does it not come down to because they can be?
Well, but they can't be if the Congress and the federal government lowers the boom on them. As
Right.
a result of that, big pharma is a highly regulated industry. In the past, I've wanted
Not in
to
pricing.
incent their, it seems to me when that issue first arose, there were some suggestions in Congress that might have even reached pricing. But I'm not sure I see how allowing Americans, not forbidding them under U.S. law from buying drugs in Canada, would raise Canadian prices. They're not going to walk into the drugstore and say, I'll tell you what, I'm American, I'll pay you double for that pharmaceutical. So.
No, but at some point there's a limit to the supply
Yeah.
that they have. And if
Unless
the
it's,
demand
unless
suddenly
it's opioids,
doubles.
then every little town has 100,000 pills.
So let me move to something that's related to both those topics of healthcare and prescriptions. As you know, the opioid crisis is hit here as hard as anywhere. And everyone we talk with has that on their agenda.
Right.
And what they usually have is a plan to free more money to devote to that. The question then becomes, well, what do you do with that if you
Yeah,
have
I mean,
more
you have
money,
to
or if you have even the money that's already
Sounds like a
there?
Bernie Sanders plan. But I thought
What do you do?
what Governor Baker did in Mass was pretty good. He got all the stakeholders in one room. He got the doctors, he got the nurse practitioners, he got the manufacturers, and he says, look, you medical community, you're not blameless here. You have to agree to protocols that for this type of ailment, you're not going to prescribe more than this, and you have to report it so people can be keeping tabs on what you're doing, so they can identify Dr. Feelgood, who has been serving the drugs with impunity in the past. And at the same time, he says to the manufacturers, you can't do this stuff anymore of sending 1 million pills to a town with a population of 30,000. You know, that's irresponsible. It's got to be proportionate. And same for the pharmacists. Nobody walked out of this happy. But what the manufacturers were doing was they didn't give a damn what the population demand would likely be. They just wanted to sell the most pills they could. So I hold them the most responsible here. But the doctors were clearly had something to put on the table as well. And so Baker convened a meeting where nobody left happy, which means it was probably a pretty good meeting. Now the reality is that the culprit, and I have buried a 20-year-old and a 21-year-old in New York City in the last couple of years who had 1 glass of white wine and 1 pill, which means it's not the opioids, it's the fentanyl that these pills are getting laced with. And that villain is as far away from China as China. You know, they find it very easy to manufacture this stuff there. And that, it's not like a big load of, and I say this as a guy who was in charge of all narcotics prosecution when I was head of the criminal division in Washington for Reagan. It's one thing to raise the price of marijuana on the street by, you know, interdicting boats on the water coming up from Aruba and Colombia, which really had very little impact except to raise the price of an ounce of marijuana on the street. That's about the only impact it had. And the mules who would be in the boat transporting this stuff up, they were totally interchangeable and replaced instantly. And if they were deported, they were on the next boat back up because they didn't take the system seriously at all. But I'm afraid the emphasis, what I'm talking suggests an emphasis on fentanyl, which is harder to detect coming in than heroin. And so it suggests that we've got to go back to old-fashioned hammer and, you know, identifying the main syndicates and going up the chain, which we used to do to get at heroin importation. And that's got to be another phase of the battle, one that I don't see written about very much. But it's the same thing a dozen years ago or so. It was crystal meth that was running through all the communities, bedroom communities around Boston and Westchester County, New York, and it took a concerted effort there to keep that a prosecution and interdiction effort to keep that out of those communities, and it took a while.
So it sounds like your priority in trying to address the crisis is in cutting off supply.
No, I even when we were doing heroin under Reagan, my speeches were you have to squeeze the balloon at both ends, and the other end from the narcotraficantes is the American home and the demand for these pills, and you know, like in mixing up bathtub gin in the 1920s when it was not otherwise available. If the demand was still there, you were going to have the product. So it's partly educational. You know, you've got to know that you have knee pain. You shouldn't be taking these pills any more than X days. And every member of the medical community bears some responsibility there. And as I say, in Baker's approach, they had to agree to protocols for what they were going to do to make public everything they were doing, so that impartial third parties, Reed enforcement personnel, could be judged of the reasonableness of what they were pouring into the system.
So you've already mentioned that in tackling big issues, it's important to have collaboration and communication between the different branches of government. But the Democrats currently hold Congress and are likely to, so if you don't have a congressional majority in Congress, how would you work with the Democrats to accomplish your goals, and also Speaker Pelosi, if she is to continue being Speaker after the
Well,
coming
I
election?
can run with the Democrats on legislation like ham and eggs. I mean, I had 5-1, 5-1 majority against me in the legislature. But I went to them the first week and said, let's have a social meeting, and we'll just have coffee and crackers, and we'll not even talk about legislation, just get to know each other better. So we did, a lot better. As a matter of fact, we began to think each other's jokes were kind of funny. And so there was never any of this running to the press and saying that guy's a jerk, or stabbing somebody in the back or the front between those meetings. It just would be unthinkable, and it really did. Ask anybody in Massachusetts. It ushered in a golden era in terms of relation between the two parties in Mass, and we did these massive collaborative projects, including massive education reform, where I just put a lot of money on the table, and in return I said I want management givebacks, I want structure, I want responsibility. So we put in high stakes tests in 4th, 8th, and 10th grade, and I had put $7 billion on the table to make sure that funding was equal across the districts. When I came in, it was $26,000 for the western suburbs of Boston, $6,000 for the minority districts. And you wonder why the minority districts in Boston had the worst schools and the worst teachers, because everyone closed their eyes and didn't care what went on in those districts. So we were able to turn that around. And the teachers union couldn't exactly say, we don't want that money because we think that's going to go to minority kids and we don't care about minority kids. But it was true. The one time I had a crowd behind me in favor of my position when I testified in the legislature was on charter schools and school choice, because there were 300 faces behind me and not a one of them was white. It was the parents in Area B of Boston who knew that they were trapped in those underperforming schools. So we broke that one. And up until that point, Massachusetts had been at the top of the bottom half of the pack in terms of performance on standardized tests, 26, 27, 28. From that year forward, and I congratulate Paul Cellucci for holding the line on this after I went, because the super liberal Dems were trying madly to repeal this, but Massachusetts has been #1 in both math and reading every year since then, for 25 years up to the present time.
Yeah.
So that was a big one. Welfare reform was another one.
These were also like a while ago, though. Do you think
Well, that's when I
that
was
same
governor.
strategy? Do you think that same strategy will work? with today's very
Human
polarized
beings are
Congress?
human beings, and goodwill begets goodwill. When I went and said, Mr. Speaker, we'll do the first meeting in your office, Mr. President, we'll do the second meeting in your office, and then we'll rotate. I didn't even say, and the third meeting will be in my office, because legislators hate being summoned to a governor's office. Not sure that's true of the White House. There's a certain cachet. We don't manufacture our own matchbooks. But no, I think treating everybody with respect is just like, we had groups of every ethnicity and religious group, and Hispanic American Commission, and East Asian, South Asian, you name it, African American, Caribbean American, and I met with them all once a month, and everybody felt like they were part of the team, which is why we went from 50% to 71% for the re-election.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for sharing it. So let's travel now from the House to the Senate. So the Senate is currently controlled by Republicans, and on climate change, your views, diverge pretty sharply from how the Republicans in the Senate currently are addressing, the issue of climate change. So if the Senate, if you were to be elected, is still led by the Republicans, how will you get them to kind of move closer towards your approach to addressing climate change than the current approach?
Yeah, the short answer is that could be a presidential emergency declaration, which would be well within the president's authority, because that's not just a national emergency, it's a planetary emergency. And, I think this president has said, I need it for, 100 miles of two steel fences with a moat between them and alligators swimming in the moat. That's not a national emergency. In fact, his whole immigration policy is just a dog whistle meant to make the people who feel they're in flyover zone and they were left behind and they lost their jobs. And by the way, that's not entirely untrue. It's one of the few bright spots of the ascendancy of Trump is I think we have much more of a sense that that has been true, and it was mainly in the middle of the country that happened. So you could either try to do it congressionally by statute, and I've got arguments to make to both the left and the right. To the left, I would say, well, I would have this fee on carbon, and it would be $500 billion a year, and it would be imposed on the coal companies to the extent they continue to exist, and the oil companies, and to some extent the natural gas companies and the mining companies, so it wouldn't fall on the consumers, but it would be remitted to the consumers, and I would remit that through a payroll tax, but concentrated on lower income taxpayers, because I'm getting to the point where there's so much social divisiveness in the country, and I do blame Mr. Trump for that I begin to worry about the social fabric. So I think you've almost got a prudential reason for worrying about income inequality and doing something about it because of all the division that the president has sown. But so for the Dems, the carrot would be helping income inequality. For the Republicans, it would be that you can theoretically afford to abolish the current regimes of taxation on gasoline and diesel. You might even want to do that anyway, because I remember from when I ran against John Kerry, people really hate paying the gas tax. It was the one time when I got a huge boost when Senator Kerry voted for an increase in the gasoline tax in Washington, and people really hated that. So not just Republicans, but that would appeal particularly to Republicans, because they think gasoline and diesel are their friends, just as they think that carbon monoxide, or the president, perhaps even alone among Republicans, thinks that methane is his friend. He wants to increase the the restrictions on methane, which is 38 times as bad as CO2 for the atmosphere. So he selected the very worst gas, and as he typically does, figuring out the wrong thing to do and then doubling down on it. I'm not kidding, or I hope I'm not exaggerating.
Do you think he's just trolling us at this point, stuff like that?
Yeah, methane has to be. I mean, someone at EPA would have had to tell him that methane was the worst gas. It was 38 times worse than CO2. And that's not atypical of him. Except now his stuff is trolling, but also serious. I'm enough of a libertarian to think that democracy is where the individual can never, should never be thrust in a corner. And it's almost as though his first reaction when some individual or some company irritates him to take off after the individual by name, or the company by name. I mean, I hate to think what he's going to say tomorrow about Mitt Romney deciding to convict him. But I'm proud of my former fellow Bay Stater and longtime colleague. But that'll be totally unprintable. Anyhow, so maybe he has some cause there, but he'll do it even when it's little people and he doesn't have any cause at all. And he says I'm just a counterpuncher. He's not. He's just vindictive. And he's vindictive because he's insecure and he has these problems with demons. Fear and anger, I think, are frequent governors his actions and his emotions.
So a gazillion-dollar question for you.
Oh.
With the infrastructure being so poor, with so many roads and bridges in need of so much work across the country, what are your priorities for fixing them, and how do you go about paying for all of the work?
Well, it's a huge ticket item, needless to say. One suggestion is to use some of the money from the carbon, I don't call it a tax, but from the carbon fee to pay for infrastructure. The tough part of it is identifying shovel-ready, imperative projects, because I did sort of take a look at the projects that were proposed for TARP relief under the Troubled Asset relief program. And a lot of them were not shovel-ready at all. It was just like iced tea, the periodic transportation funding bill. It was like a granddaddy of all iced teas. And the froth and the foam at the mouth of every lobbyist in Washington when iced tea came on the plate was like no other froth and foam, because they knew it was a ton of money. So they would dress up their projects as imperative, and the most common hue and cry is my roads and bridges are crumbling, particularly my bridges are crumbling, and your citizens are going to fall to their death. And I suppose it just takes a lot of homework to figure out where that's true and why, Mr. Governor, have you allowed your bridges to fall to this state. But I'm not absolutely sure that there's enough money, certainly not in $500 billion a year, to make a big dent there. I'd like to develop a societal consensus that we need more light rail, commuter rail. I've gone from commuting by car from Cambridge to my office every day, Cambridge, Mass., to taking the commuter rail from Reedville, which is Ward 18 in Boston, right in South Station. My office is right by South Station. And it's so much more pleasant. I'm kind of a rail buff, light rail. We're going to have to make some adjustments within 10 years anyway, because we're going to have driverless vehicles. We're going to need to take and electronic vehicles, hydrogen vehicles. We're going to need to take a ton of cars off the road. I actually found that attractive in President Obama's first campaign, when he said we have to stop organizing our society and our zoning patterns around the reach of the internal combustion engine, which is quite true. And he acted on it too, but I do think that's the wave of the future.
So in terms of your priorities, would you look more at shovel-ready projects first, or how do you go about trying to figure out what do you do first?
No, I might want to take more of a bird's eye view and try and shift things towards rail and public transportation. I hate to say it as a Republican. I've participated in a great American love affair with my vehicles over the years. Actually, driverless cars are going to come in just in time for me, because 15 years, just when I don't feel like driving anymore, there won't be any more cars on the road. We moved recently. I was brought up in the woods in Long Island, New York, lots of woods then, and it's all malls now. And we recently moved to the Great Blue Hills Wildlife Refuge, just south of Boston, Milton and Canton. And if you stand in my office building and look south, you can see why they're called the Blue Hills. But it's 7,000 acres, and all of our neighbors are coyotes and deer and buzzards and turkey, which is just how I like it. And maybe that's another way to get around all the lack of roads and cars. Go off grid.
I want to circle back. You talked about zero-based budgeting as a way to bring the deficit under control. A big chunk of the budget every year is from entitlement programs. So and there's not a whole lot of flexibility sometimes with that. So what would your approach on?
Everyone told me I couldn't cut the mass budget. Admittedly, the entitlement situation is a little more severe and baked in Washington. But I realized in pretty short order that the fact that governor was my first elected job was an advantage for me, because I didn't understand that there were sacred cows in the budget, and I didn't even know that they were cows. So, if they were not like a preventive health program that paid for itself last year, I didn't care how popular it was. And a lot of them were popular because they had a lot of political backing, because they were supporting an army of state workers that didn't need to be there. And I did furlough and permanently 8,000 state workers on my first day in office. And the payroll was somewhat swelled because Governor Dukakis had run for president, in 1988, and I was elected in 90. But no one ever pointed out that the payroll had gotten swollen. It was hugely swollen. So I took the state payroll from 72,000 to 64,000 my first week in office. I never got a postcard about where are those essential state workers that you furloughed right on day one. So I think it can be done. Now there are many more federal programs that say, this is non-discretionary, you have to do this, but I use all the muscle at my command, and a newly elected president does have some political capital to spend, and I would spend a lot of that targeting a few outrageous bureaucracies to make my case stronger, and say, we don't need this. This is the person who was chair of House Ways and Means or Senate Ways and Means in 1920, and the program has never gone away. And what's it do now? So just as I would spare no potential cut, I would not feel obliged to cut everything at all. Anyone says I'm going to come in and do a 10% cut across the board doesn't know what they're talking about. That's not a responsible position. And anyone who says I'm going to balance the budget by cutting waste, fraud, and abuse knows even less about the budget, because you can't slice it that way. And P.S. they wouldn't know an example of that if you asked them. That's just a political soundbite. So it takes a lot of work, and that's not something that people in Washington, certainly not in the White House, are interested in doing. We're going to lose 15% of all the jobs in the United States owing to artificial intelligence and drones and robotics and driverless vehicles and machine learning 10 years from today. I went out and did a pilgrimage to every smart person on AI in Palo Alto and San Francisco several months ago. But I thought it was a worthwhile investment. And they all say, actually, AI is not going to be all bad. It's going to create wealth because of making the economy more efficient. And P.S., the other good news is for all those workers who are displaced, in the new, more technical economy, there will be replacement jobs at higher wages than the jobs they lost. The only wrinkle is they're going to need 3 semesters of post-high school training and education in technical areas. They don't now have those skills. So I said 3 semesters of post-high school education. Scratch. Took out the Massachusetts budget, which is familiar to me, and I calculated that it would cost 1/3 of 1% of the state budget to pay for all those people to get those 3 semesters at no cost to them, either because it's an online program or an online program under the shelter of a community college or a straight community college program. And having been 2 terms as governor, finding 1/3 of a percent of the state budget, you can find that under a rock, because there are always, accounts pending and accounts holding. In other words, governors have priorities. And, if you lose 15% of your workforce, that's a priority. So you can definitely make room for that. But, and these are Trump voters. They, by definition, lost their jobs to the marching, the onward march of automation, which they don't like one little bit. I'm just reading a new book, not a new book, but a book called The Second Machine Age, which has made me understand almost for the first time how digitization is going to totally change everything. It's about 10 years from now. People say 10 to 20. Everybody in Palo Alto and San Francisco told me 10 years. But again, Washington is not rolling up its sleeves and going to work, and the president is not rolling up his sleeves and going to work. And say what you will about Obama, he was up until midnight every day reading position papers. He'd have dinner with his wife and daughters, and then go be up until midnight, deep stuff. I thought he underperformed in the second term, but that doesn't mean he wasn't a hard worker. Mr. Trump is not a hard worker, and in the international area, if you're going to be engaged in the world and have summit conferences and diplomacy, you can't do it with no preparation. So this is a fundamental beef I have with Mr. Trump. Sorry to keep returning to him, but it's kind of why I'm running. I would not have done this in 2017 when we didn't know how Mr. Trump was going to comport himself in office, and now we do know.
So, but specifically with entitlement programs, Social Security, Medicare, are there particular concerns you have? There are particular approaches that you want?
Yeah. My concerns are the Social Security Trust Fund has to be totally restructured, and that's going to be expensive. Like the infrastructure is going to be expensive. There are a few little things that can be done now. Raise the retirement age. Probably the most important is increasing the amount of money at the beginning that can be subject to Social Security. And the third one is having a means test. And all three of those are very unpopular. Because people say, this came in, it was a promise, everyone said, this is your money. Well, we got to make some small changes along the way to restructuring the trust fund. And by the way, I've talked to experts on Social Security, and I've just said the three things I just said to you, which come to me off the top of my head. And they've said, yeah, those are the big three, but we can't touch them. Well, if you're going to be like me, there would be no, we can't touch them. Because none of those would be grinding the face of people who expect Social Security and who are not going to get it as a result of those changes, which is what you don't want. But you definitely don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater by not restructuring the trust fund. And it's one of the reasons I tell younger voters that the $1 trillion a year deficits are a generational issue aimed right at them. And climate change issue is a generational issue aimed right at them. I'm not worried about my beach place. I don't have a beach place. But if I have mountain places. If I did have a beach place, I wouldn't be worried about it.
Could be a beach place.
Yeah, we could be getting shorefront property in Gilsum, that's right. I'm not worried about the 47-foot storm surge, but man, if you don't solve climate change, that's a coming.
So to your view, how do you think a president should approach issues like gender inequality and racial inequality that still persist? I mean, how
I've got a long record there. I was right out of the box for LGBT, well, there wasn't any T in those days, it was the 90s, but gay and lesbian, civil rights, and marriage equality. I absolutely led that from 1991 forward, and for 20 years I was the only governor or senator on that bandwagon. People thought I was nutso. And I was also very strongly in favor of reproductive rights and not having a bunch of big fat white congressmen who live 2,250 miles away telling people whether or not they're going to have a child. And the statutes that they've recently passed about how if a woman is raped, her rapist has more rights than she does. A couple of statutes in the South and a couple in the Midwest with the active approval and support of the Trump administration. It's just, again, it sounds and seems to me like doubling down on the wrong thing. Racial, I'll tell you a quick story, but I don't want to get you guys perilously close to 4 o'clock here. So I was out in Detroit for the annual meeting of the NAACP. The week after Mr. Trump had said, why don't you go back where you came from, to the 4 Democratic congresswomen of color. And I was with the top 10 Democrats, and I spoke 11th because I was a Republican. But I was not there at sufferance because I have a long history with minorities, and I was elected with a Rainbow Coalition to begin with, the first term. Second term, everybody voted for us. And so the Democrats all danced around that and didn't really mention it. I think they've taken an oath not to mention Trump. So I get up there, I'm not party to any agreements. I say, great to be here, thank you for having me. Let's get one thing clear right at the outset. Mr. Trump, President Trump, is an outrageous racist. And now every person in D.C. has a decision to make. And they think it's a political decision. But it's not a political decision. It's a moral decision. And if they don't expressly disavow this president's outrageous racism, and I mean expressly, there's going to be havoc at the ballot box, and they're all going to lose their seats, and they deserve to. Standing O in the crowd, which had not even stirred in its chair for the first 10 speeches. And, you know, when I spent the $7 billion to equalize funding to make the inner city kids get funding, and when I, went after the banks and insurance companies on redlining, because they get together and make it harder for people to get a mortgage who live in the inner city, and when I support charter schools, the black population appreciates that. And, my theory in general is you don't want any individual or any group to either be stigmatized or to have to live in the shadows. And the reason the president's immigration policy bothers me so much is because he wants people to be living in the shadows. He wants to have second-class citizens and third-class citizens, and he wants to live it up with his lily-white, super-rich, it's a combination of the super-rich and the neo-Nazis and the white nationalists. It's not a pretty sight. And he's been going to Eastern and Western Europe since 2010 palling around with the alt-right government, starting with Le Pen in France and then Austria, and now he's got Viktor Orban in Hungary, who used to be a good guy 12 years ago. Now he's tilting alt-right. Erdogan in Turkey, the president's eating out of his hand. Even Bill Barr, who's Looney Tunes on the constitutional issues applicable to the president, has been reported recently to be very concerned that the president was promising things of great value to foreign leaders if they would just tilt alt-right. Why he wants to do that, I don't know. I mean, I think he's got the wrong head on politically. So someone, I don't know.
So in 50 weeks, you're inaugurated. We are where we are. We have the president we have right now.
Yeah.
In 50 weeks, what do you do to change that culture?
Well, I come in with a bipartisan cabinet, and I reach across the aisle to the legislature, both bodies, irrespective of party, and I say, you know, we'd love to have social meetings once a week with your leadership, and I'd start with the social, and then maybe later I'd go to, you know, maybe we could have a meeting on a topic of choice, you know, on the Hill, wherever. I remember when Jerry Brown came into office in California the first time around, a long time ago, I think it was the 70s, and I was barely old enough to pay attention, but he became massively popular and effective because he never held a meeting in the State House. He didn't even live in the governor's mansion, and he was pretty close to the days when he almost became a monk. But he would go to people's office, and he's not a stupid guy. He would ask a lot of questions, and they thought, this is something different, this is good. And I would aim at that type of effect. So, you know, I do the same thing I did in Massachusetts, trying to make every individual and every group feel that they were part of the effort to have the most glorious society that we could. Never losing sight of aggregate national wealth, but not wanting to focus it too much on the top 0.0001%.
So let's continue talking about foreign policy.
Yeah.
So some more questions about that. So you advocate diplomacy and say you'll hold out kind of on the threat of military action. But I'm curious in what circumstances you would initiate action that's not, you know, defensive against another country.
Boy, that'd be a cold day in July, seriously.
Could you say a little more about that?
Well, I don't believe in sending boots on the ground of, you know, 18 to 23-year-old kids to a foreign country to effectuate regime change. And this has happened under both Democratic and Republican presidents, and I can think of one example, Iraq in 2003, that, you know, it'd be an understatement to say that didn't turn out too well. But that was, you know, sending boots on the ground to a foreign country because we saw something there we didn't like. And Donald Trump is very given to that also. He's very emotional. He got all mad at something in the Middle East that wasn't going his way. So he said the same day, without his own people even knowing about it, I'm about to send 5,000 more troops to the Middle East. And I'm not sure he knew which countries he was talking about sending them to, but he had to express his irritation. So I don't regard him, you know, during the campaign, one of the reasons I liked him was that he kind of said, I don't want boots on the ground for regime change indiscriminately. And I, Donald Trump, want the troops out of Afghanistan. I, Bill Weld, also want the troops out of Afghanistan. So I thought that was a plus. And he was elected as something of an amalgam. You know, he had some issues that were attractive to the libertarian point of view. But I just don't think he has the ability to conduct foreign policy because as he says, I won't listen to anybody. I've been told by former directors of the CIA and sitting members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, at least one, very prominent, the most exhausting thing they've ever had to do and terrifying is briefing Donald J. Trump about national security issues. Because after 60 seconds, a light goes off in his eyes, and he knows that they can tell he isn't paying attention.
Yeah.
Go on, keep talking, I'm listening. Hey, have you seen this magazine? That's not a bad picture.
Yeah. So you've kind of made it clear that you would be, you know, a contrast from President Trump, but how would you, you know, personally define U.S. interests in making foreign policy
Well, I
decisions
think
or
free trade is very
decisions?
much in our interest. We have by far the highest productivity workforce in the world, so free trade is always going to benefit us. We always get the high wage jobs out of that. You need the military to keep open the sea lanes and the air lanes for free trade and for commerce.
Yeah.
And I don't think Mr. Trump understands that allies are force multipliers, so it's good to have allies. It would not be good for Vladimir Putin to get Western Europe and Eastern Europe back within the Soviet Union, which is what Mr. Trump plainly wants with his undermining of NATO and his caper with Ukraine. That casts a longer shadow than just impeachment. And now he's going to do it with every country. I do think that's true, knowing that he has a ticket to do that. So, another area that I think Mr. Trump doesn't understand at all is nuclear non-proliferation. He's encouraged Japan and South Korea to develop their own programs. I thought he got us pretty close to the brink of somebody pulling the trigger in his bromance turning into bellicosity overnight with Kim and North Korea. So I not only don't agree with him on the merits, I don't think he has the stability to conduct a foreign policy that will let our allies and the people who are not developing nuclear weapons programs, because they're kind of relying on us to have their back in case the big bad bear comes after them, and we kind of have to do that. So that's one area where I think we do have to be in and of the world. That's kind of a unspoken pact we've had ever since World War II with other countries and other people who are, would be tasty meat for a China or a Russia if we, turn our backs on them.
Yeah.
And I don't agree with his policy of starting with tariffs and sanctions wherever negotiations are concerned. It's straight out of The Art of the Deal, page 1. Take a very unreasonable position up front, be as unpleasant as you possibly can, and as unreasonable as you possibly can, and they will have to come to you. Doesn't sound like diplomacy.
Let's, I want to return and kind of stay on the idea of trade for a second. So you've said that you want to rejoin, what's now called the CCTPP. And I'm interested to know your thoughts on the USMCA.
Well, the USMCA is essentially the same as NAFTA. I participated in the negotiation of NAFTA, both with Jaime Sarapuche and Pedro Aspe in Mexico and Michael Wilson in Canada. And remember, the day before the vote, Newt Gingrich and I were in the White House with Bill Clinton, the sitting president, and Bill Daley from Chicago, who I think was his Commerce Secretary, although maybe at that point he was just in charge of rounding up votes for NAFTA. And that required Republican votes on the floor to get that passed, which is what I was doing there and what Gingrich was doing there. And it was a great deal, and it was better for all three countries. I actually commissioned, I was the lead author of a book on building a stronger North America, published in 2005 for the Council on Foreign Relations on that very topic. And it was fine, and it was helping everybody. The president massively misunderstands that. I've been told by people from Canada, Mexico, and China, and they didn't have to tell me because he says it himself. He thinks everything is a zero-sum game. So you have to poke your adversary, not your counterpart, your adversary in the eye. And Deng Jiahua, who's a member of the Politburo in China, told me he was just couldn't stop laughing. He said that Mr. Trump thinks that a car manufactured in North America is manufactured either in Canada or the United States or Mexico. The average car manufactured in North America goes across the Mexican border 22 times, because every stage of production they put it where the requisite wage scale is appropriate to the wage earned by people in that country. So the lower wage stages always go to Mexico, the higher wage ones go to the U.S. So we get the engineering jobs, we get the sales jobs, Mexico gets these jobs. Mm-hmm. They're happy to have them, but trade across borders is always going to benefit the United States.
Yeah. With our relationship with China, there is the issue though of kind of China abusing the U.S. intellectual property rights.
Yeah, no kidding.
So what would you do about that?
So I'd make it clear to the Chinese up front that there are two issues where we don't have any sense of humor. One is intellectual property. They reverse engineer everything. In 2008, they changed their criminal law they modeled it on the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1892. Whoever shall interfere with the full exploitation of intellectual property in any written agreement, written venture, a joint venture or a licensing agreement between a non-Chinese company and a Chinese company shall be guilty of imprisoned 5 years, blah, blah, blah. Criminal offense. So if they want to now, they can say, you interfered with the full exploitation of this license by preventing the Chinese from reverse engineering the IP. So that's one. The other one is the state-owned enterprises. Xi Jinping came into office, the SOEs. Xi Jinping came in promising that he was going to end the subsidies for SOEs, and they had to stand on their own 2 feet. That lasted a few months. Now they're right back to the subsidies like before. And we are getting our brains beat in Africa and countries all over the world where the Chinese will parachute in. They have this thing called the Chinese National Railway, and they can create railroad tracks like that, not one at a time. They just roll them out of this machine, and they can go 10, 12, 15 miles a day. And particularly in Africa, where I've spent a lot of time working for resource companies and technology companies, they come in and they do that, and they say, P.S. we already built the road from the airport to the capital, and we built these 6 schools and these 6 hospitals. And all we want is a lousy 15-year take-or-pay contract for all your copper and your platinum and your palladium and your rhenium and your rare earths. That's all we want. And they're going to stay in the ground unless you sign with us. So, like I say, we're getting our brains beat in. And the reason the Chinese companies have the money to do that is because the government's giving it to them. So those 2 issues, we'd say we're not flexible, and we're going to beat your brains in. And Xi Jinping said when he came in to the United States, we have 1,000 reasons to be friends. And I agree with that, and I think what he meant was we have 1,000 touch points. And because we have 1,000 touch points, it's possible with the Chinese in particular to have multi-corner deals. And I'll keep this very short, but with respect to the Koreas, I would go to the Chinese and say, you lean on North Korea, at the same time be nice to them and give them more money because they're all starving to death. We will give them more money because they're all starving to death. We want you to lean on them to lighten up on the nuclear weapons. We will lean on the South Koreans to lighten up. It's really us, not the South Koreans, but all these missiles aimed at South Korea, 9 miles away from Pyongyang, because we're sure the North doesn't like that. And the North is very paranoid about that. And maybe the troop levels in South Korea. And by the way, the Chinese are right behind the North Koreans. And so, we weren't too keen about the Russian missiles being 90 miles away from us at the time. They were in Cuba in the 60s. And we can understand how, the other people don't like all those missiles there. So if we did all those things, then I think that would be a slight balance in our favor. So I'd do something nice for the Chinese over here. Multi-corner deal. It would take a certain amount of trust, but I was working with Don Gregg when I was just in office. He was the ambassador to South Korea. We came pretty close to serious talks for the reunification of the peninsula, spiked by the North just at the last minute. But it looked like it was going to happen, and I think, the North Koreans have to have their standard of living increased. But I thought the one smart thing about Trump's first summit with Kim was he had it in Hanoi, which is a glittering city, and he could point to it and say, someday, my son, all this can be yours. So this would employ that stratagem in addition to others.
So one of the signature issues of the Trump administration is immigration. And it seems like largely the current administration wants to just stop that.
Yeah.
Just stop letting people into our country.
Yeah.
It's ours. So your take is that you would not want to do that. You see a benefit economically in
Right.
letting people into the country. So when people under the Weld administration show up at our borders looking for entry, what are you going to base access on?
A work visa. We need a lot more work visas. In the last cycle, I spent half my time in the western half of the country, and you couldn't staff the agriculture or the construction industry in the anywhere left of Texas without people coming over. Yes, the Mexican border. Even in the Northeast, where tourism is a major industry, there are a lot of jobs being unfilled that immigrants would be only too happy to fill. And we need a more robust guest worker program, such as Canada has. It's for seasonal employees, 4 or 5 months a year. I think it's called H-2B. And I happen to remember that one of the categories has a national quota of 60,000 of this type of visa. It's gone in January, and I don't mean January 2nd, I mean January 1st. And I know this from my law practice. I don't do it, but my firm does a good bit of immigration and asylum work. More broadly, I think the whole thing on Trump's part is just a political calculus. It's kind of a dog whistle. It's Rudy from Oklahoma. You lost your job. You should be plenty ticked off about that. That guy probably crawled through the mud to get over the Mexican border to come take your job, and the next thing he's going to do is harass your wife. They're all murderers and rapists, So following that, he began with this series of dog whistles about. He started with the Muslims, and then it was the Mexicans, but it was just any ethnic group from outside, including Democratic congresswomen of color, anybody who wasn't quite like us. And I know it's a nasty thing to say that he wants an all-white society to the extent he can have one, but man, he said that so many different ways, so many times.
So
I think it's true.
In terms of a work visa being the criteria so if somebody shows up seeking asylum.
Oh, well, that's different. That goes to court. The experts, I think, will say pretty unanimously that what you need to control the southern border is not the wall, it's more people, more Border Patrol agents, more judges, so that we don't get the asylum and refugee cases stacked up at the border and wind up with children being thrown in cages. It's as though the administration had written the rules to try to make things as unpleasant for people at the border as possible, winding up with families being literally ripped apart, children in cages, go back where you came from, you can't apply from there. Before Trump, we didn't have that. We processed refugee and asylum cases in the ordinary course. So, and compared to infrastructure, it's very short money to get more border agents, and more drones is the third thing they say we need. More border agents, more judges, and more drones. Then we will not anymore have lost control of the border. Whereas a wall can be surmounted, and a wall is a very bad symbol for the United States of America. The Berlin Wall and Checkpoint Charlie was a stain on the Soviet Union, and I think contributed to its fall in the last 15 years or so of its existence.
So you've advocated or talked before about abolishing the U.S. Department of Education.
I have. Yeah.
And I would guess that would mean that educational decisions like that would be left up to the states. So how would you ensure that kids across the country, kids in this state and this state, would have equal access to a quality education?
Well, it's been pointed out to me that the Department of Education does some things that the federal government has to do, like educating Americans abroad and helping with that. So I'm afraid that abolishing the whole department may not be practicable. Having said that, I do think of education as predominantly a state and local issue in terms of K through 12. And there's also a Higher Education Act which intersects with the college and university community, but I'm not so concerned about how that has to be a state and local level, because I'm saying the states and localities should take care of the education of our children through high school, because that's a time when intersection between parents and children is still a very strong bond, and I'm just not wild about. At the time, I was a big backer of the No Child Left Behind Act. Less so now. I think there's a lot of it was billed as a race to the top. I don't think it's necessarily worked out that way. I think the latest proposal is Common Core, which I'm dead set against. It would be a disaster for Massachusetts because it would be dumbing down compared to what we got now. And I understand the impulse. The impulse is to make sure someone's there to look out for Mississippi and Louisiana. Maybe we can figure out some other way to do that than by having a separate department.
So you don't think there should be any kind of national standards for education?
Well, not the ones we have now. They come with a lot of you have to do this, a lot of you have to do that, and I think they outweigh the benefits. K through 12, I'm talking about.
Mhm. Well, talking about higher education, I mean, it's well known that so many kids are saddled with so much debt from their college educations.
Right.
I mean, especially here in New Hampshire. I mean, how do you address that? You know,
Every which way possible. We got 3 millennials in the house, including one who just finished Columbia School of Journalism and now has, what is it, $120,000? 110. But, I know many other friends that we have 8 children and 9 grandchildren. So many friends of my children have $200,000, $250,000 of debt. They can't even take an interesting job that's not quite so high paying as the rival jobs because they can't afford to pay the nut on the loans. And there has to have been a lot of fraud in the inducement to have these kids take out these loans. It's the only loan in the world that's not renegotiable. So by act of Congress, and that has to be repealed right away. And the only way you can pay back that loan is by paying it back or dying. You can't refinance it. There's no reason for that. They may as well hang on a sign and say, "We hate students," to go next to the "We hate women" sign for some of the other statutes we talked about. But I would expand and maybe even improve the terms of the public service method of paying your loans back. If you agree to do public service, teach in public schools for 5 years, all bets are off. It's gone. I would have a similar provision for tax-free forgiveness, and it has to be tax-free, or you just have another tax bill the same amount as your loan practically. For someone who, for a period of years, I don't know, 10, 15, 18 years, has paid principal and interest, it's got to be forgiven. And you can build that into the loan rate, into the interest rate if you want. But that has to happen, or else kids will be indentured servitude, indentured servants to the federal loan, the federal student loan, until they're in their 40s. And that's not a picture I like. So the same, that would be length of time, public service, the rate itself, the interest rate can be negotiated down. But there's one I'm forgetting, but there are at least 5 separate types of proposals to get that down and make sure it doesn't last too long. And it is now hurting labor mobility because it's determining where people can afford to live. And even kids in Boston right now, where there's scads of high-paying jobs, they can't afford to take the job because there's no housing. I guess this is housing. So they drive till they can afford it, which is an hour and 15 minutes west of Boston. The housing price goes down as you get further away. Very sympathetic to the plight of millennials and other children who are carrying a lot of debt through personal. And we can see exactly how it impacts the freedom of motion, freedom of choice of those kids.
So we are getting up against it
Yeah.
time-wise, and I know you've got to make your way to Nashville, I think, tonight.
Nashville tonight. We're back here. We have a town hall in Keene on Saturday.
Right. Before we go, though, just talk briefly about election security.
Well, that's cybersecurity, stopping them from hacking. And I've been briefed a lot by former heads of the Central Intelligence Agency about what we have to do in cybersecurity, and the residue of what I retained was we have to make it so painful for them to hack us that they'd rather not do it because the game isn't worth the candle for them. And all the ways we do that, I'm not quite sure I'm the best person to explain it. I do believe that the Russians succeeded in hacking, the state of Illinois in 2016, one of the states and one other big area. And there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that it was the Russians that did that. I can't be your insurance company that the Ukrainians didn't also do it, because I know from having been in a senior position in Washington in the Justice Department that countries spy on each other all the time. And in those days, it was the 80s, there wasn't quite so much cyber warfare, it was just old-fashioned spying. So I'm not sure that's going to go away. Let's just call it keeping an eye on each other. But in the case of the Soviet Union, it's malicious because they want to scramble everything in the West. And they're not just doing that to us, they're doing that to Western Europe and Eastern Europe and all these chickens they want to have come right back in the coop. And the more disorganized they are, and the more they're all at swords points with each other, the way Mr. Trump has made Americans, the better it is for the takeover. And in the case of Russia, it's Soviet Union taking over. In the case of the disorganized, exhausted Americans, it's Mr. Trump taking over. It's not the Republican Party, it's Mr. Trump.